it doesn't really get more epic than a clash between the Primarchs. Now, a couple years back, our team had the absolute pleasure of working on 3 scenes that brought these legendary demigods to life in full-blown cinematic dioramas. Now, these dioramas took an insane amount of work, from planning to figuring out the composition to approaching painting, and most importantly, making sure these things looked badass. Now, sadly, these pieces are no longer in our collection, and our cameras, sets, and photo equipment were not quite what they are today. Nevertheless, we managed to get enough photos and videos of the process that I thought it would be worth sharing this behind the scenes look. So this is gonna be a very documentary style video. I also wasn't as deep into the 40K lore back at the time, and if I was approaching this today, maybe there are some things that I would do differently. So this was approached more from an artistic lens in the way that we chose to tackle the composition, the color choices, and everything to do with bringing the story together. Today's video is going to be exploring the first of the 3 dioramas, the first one that we actually completed, and perhaps the most mysterious of the trio. We're gonna kick things off with the Alpha Legion, the most enigmatic of the traitor legions, led by not 1, but 2 Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon. Or is it just 1? Or is it 2? You never really know with the Alpha Legion, do you? It's always mysteries upon mysteries, but at the very least, we do know that these 2 guys are on the same team. So it didn't really make sense to try and stage a direct conflict between these 2, but rather to approach it more like a tag team battle with these guys carving their path through a swarm of enemies coming at them at the top of a hill. And to complement the mysterious and eerie nature of the Alpha Legion, we chose to go with a coral landscape, mostly because it would open up a color palette that would allow us to imbue that kind of mood into this scene. And this doesn't tie into the lore in any way, at least as far as I'm aware, but it did allow it to have a very unique feeling that would stand out in context to the other dioramas. Our main inspiration came from the coral Highlands in Monster Hunter, which had all these beautiful pale hues that created a very otherworldly feeling and would also contrast perfectly with the teal-green armor of the Alpha Legion. As for the models themselves, we were going to be stuck working with 2 of the Forge World Alpharius models, which obviously are the exact same. Though there was something cool about the idea of them literally being like a mirror reflection of one another. So the fact that the poses were identical was actually going to be kind of cool. But we also didn't want them to be exactly the same. So the plan was to do a light conversion on the main Alpharius, swapping the 2-handed spear pose instead for a sword and a signature master-crafted plasma blaster, which would involve a little bit of sculpting on my part. In terms of the composition, I wanted to make them feel like they were one unified and synchronized force of destruction. Again, not literally fighting back to back. I did want to space them out a little bit so that you could appreciate each model on its own, and so that they had some space in between them to shine and slay their enemies. Which brings us to the 3rd character in this whole composition, which is all of the dead Marines that were going to be scattered between them, which were meant to create a sense of an ongoing battle raging around them. Now, obviously, this is a pretty complex idea with a lot of moving pieces, so anytime I approach something like this, I like to mock it up first using some oil-based clay. Here, I was using monster clay, and this is just a great way to get an early sense of the composition, where the key details are going to go. And the thing that I like better about this is that it's in 3D, so you get a sense of how it's really going to look and feel as a final product, rather than trying to do something like a Photoshop mockup. I feel like this gives you a more hands-on idea of how to approach the actual build. The front-facing Alpharius was designed to be the main focal point, while Omegon, in contrast, was going to be kind of like his shadowy counterpart, watching his back. Now, based on the existing poses of the miniatures, I had to work with the fact that they were both looking and attacking downwards. The original Forge World Alpharius model has him posed with a 2-handed spear, stabbing a Marine on the ground. So given that, I had to allow for a little bit of a downward slope in front of each of these models, which led me into more of a triangular composition that starts at the front of the base with the scattered bodies and then guides your eye upwards to the main Alpharius. Then, with the angle of his raised weapon hand, this should help you to flow over to Omegon in the upper corner. Again, I think there was something cool about having Omegon's back turned. I feel like it adds a little bit of intrigue, and also it encourages the viewer to walk around the piece or rotate it and see what sort of secrets and details lie on that back side of the diorama as well. As for the actual landscape of this piece, it was carved out of cork. Many layers of cork. A process that I'm quite familiar with, as it used to be the extent of my basing creativity before we made our epic basing bits. This build actually uses some of my earliest designs from our range with those big curvy tube sponges that we have since updated. The build also uses bush corals and corallium, as well as some succulents, since this was more of an alien planet vibe than something that's literally under the sea. We also worked in some blister copper, mostly on the undersides of the base, as kind of a hidden mineral feature that I thought would be an interesting detail on the back of the base. And also, its bubbly appearance lends a bit of an aquatic feel to the scene, which I thought felt appropriate. And many of these bits were scaled up in size from their original size, which is a very helpful feature of working with our STL files, especially when you're working with a large base or a diorama where you might want to show more diversity in the sizes and shapes of your basing details. And we always test our designs at 80%, 100%, and 120% of their original size to make sure that these are all viable, though in some cases you can even go outside these ranges and get some pretty cool results. And there was a lot of surface area to cover here, which I'll admit was quite a challenge at the time, because this was actually the first time I got to work on a scene of this size using the basing bits. And since then, I've learned a lot about how to tackle large bases and how to place and build off of key details, which I shared in my video about taking bases to max. Now, for the conversion bits, I didn't really have much of a good reference for any of Alpharius's secondary weapons, though I did decide to take some inspiration from the original spear design and continue with this sort of double-bladed approach for the sword. As for the plasma blaster, they all sort of follow the same format, so the only unique part I decided to work in here was a Hydra head on the front of that blaster, so it just looks like he's breathing plasma fire on his enemies. Now, the base was the first thing that we chose to tackle when it came to painting. We had to set the stage and establish the mood of the scene. Guided by our reference from the coral Highlands, we leaned heavily into the pale purples and magentas throughout the terrain. Again, keeping these colors soft and the saturation low was very intentional, as it would allow the highly saturated color of the blue armor as well as the green power weapons to really stand out on multiple levels. The most vibrant red corals were concentrated towards the top of the composition, which was strategically placed to help pull the viewer's gaze upwards, and it would also create a very nice framing effect next to the Primarchs themselves. Having that layering of the green armor next to the more intense reds of the coral creates a strong color contrast, which would make sure that the attention flowed in that direction. Now, figuring out what to do with the dead Marines was a little bit tricky, because we wanted to make sure that the scene still felt vibrant, that they kind of worked in with the lighter tones of this coral atmosphere, and we didn't want them to draw too much attention away from the Primarchs themselves. So we were looking for a lighter colored armor scheme. And after chatting with our friend Omegon Edge, he introduced us to the Sajar Mazan, which were Marines who had sided with the pro-Horus elements within the White Scars. Now, given that the White Scars on the whole stayed loyal, these members were disgraced and condemned as oathbreakers, and the Khan essentially ordered them to form squads that would conduct suicidal raids so that they could find some salvation in death. So not only was this a very fitting narrative, but it also allowed us to use that white colored armor scheme, which would fit our environment very nicely. So the colors overall in the scene were meant to flow from a soft palette with minimal contrast in the foreground, which helped it to feel a bit more open despite all of the details that are scattered amongst it, and then move through the bodies and the terrain towards those intense red tones at the top that frame our key focal points. Now, when it came to the models, we wanted to make sure that the main Alpharius stayed true to the classic Alpha Legion color scheme. That intense blue-green armor was going to be the main focal point and the main thing that we planned all the other colors around. For Omegon, though, we decided to swap the color of the armor and the cape so that he was still his own distinct character, but kind of also operated as that mirror image of his brother. Not identical, but flipped. And again, the black armor also helped to sell that sort of shadowy figure idea. This contrast between the two models also helped to clearly establish which was the main focal point and which one was meant to be secondary. Now, I'll say this, among all the complex details in this build, the coral, the scattered bodies, the gleaming armor, the most pleasant thing to paint by far were the capes. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Alpharius' scaly armor from a sculptural perspective. It's visually striking and the dragon scales totally hit on that Hydra theme that the Alpha Legion is known for. But from a painting perspective, it's just an absolute nightmare. Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit dramatic here, but there's just nothing more mentally draining than endless surface interruptions when you're trying to paint. It's just that every little scale or every little rivet or detail breaks up those smooth brushstrokes and turns everything into a meticulous slog where you're just painting with the tip of your brush. And to be honest, this is the case with most of the Forge World Primarchs, which just means that I'm not the biggest fan of them from a painting perspective, but they certainly still do look cool. But the one reprieve from all of this was the capes. Just a breath of fresh air. The beautiful flowing structure of the capes really allowed us to have much more liberal brushstrokes that allowed us to build things up layer by layer and create a very nuanced surface that just absolutely shimmers in the breeze. I love searching for interesting reflection points in shapes like these and shifting the tones and temperatures of the colors from the light areas to the shadowy areas. Again, this just feels like such a more pleasant painting process, one where you're collaborating with the surface rather than fighting against it. But overall, this was a really cool and fun scene to paint despite all of the work that it took, from all the interesting coral details that we got to play around with to the color scheme, which really allowed us to shift tones from one detail to the next, and of course the gleaming figures of the Primarchs themselves taking the center stage. It was both exciting to see this come to fruition and a little bit concerning knowing just how much work would go into the next two. I am really happy with how the colors turned out on this project, so much so that I almost went and repeated the same thing when I went and concepted out the planet Laren, which I'd intended for the Emperor's Children, and I built that using our coral reef basing set. Of course, with a lot of new coral options, I think those ones turned out even more diverse, and I would have been excited to see how I could build out this larger scale diorama using some of those newer pieces. I even decided to check out how the Luna Wolves scheme would fit on these bases, so it looks like we've got more white marines finding their way into this coral landscape. And it would be really cool to tackle a project of this scale using the new tools and knowledge that I have at my disposal, so maybe we'll have to revisit this Primarch theme sometime in the future. I hope you enjoyed this project recap and learned some cool stuff along the way about how to approach a large piece such as this. If you want to see more hobby tips and techniques, then please like this video and drop us a comment on what types of stuff you would like to see us cover in the future. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can follow along and check out the next two dioramas in this series. I truly appreciate all of your support. It helps to keep us growing and making cool stuff, which is what this hobby is all about. Now remember to get back to your hobby desk, get inspired, and go make it epic.